welcome back to my channel. My name is Georgia and I'm a knit and crochet designer, and today I'm going to show you how to make this really easy knitted jumper. All we do is knit 4 rectangles and then sew them together. So you just need to knit back and forth. So you need to know how to cast on, knit stitch, purl stitch and bind off. And then the sewing process is so easy. Please don't be intimidated by it. It's also really good if you're an advanced knitter like me and you just want an easy project. If you prefer a PDF version of a pattern, then I'll leave the link in the description to that below. Did that make sense? I know you know what I mean. So if you do purchase the PDF pattern, then thank you, because every sale counts. Obviously these tutorials are for free, and so that just really helps me be able to create more tutorials for you guys. One thing I do want to note is that the fact that this is made with mohair, one thing I found was that it's really easy to drop stitches, and I actually made like one of these whole panels and then had to like redo the whole thing again because I dropped 6 stitches without even realising it. And then when I got to the end, I just counted how many stitches were left on my needles, and there was 6 less than what I started with. And then when I took a closer look, I could see like where I dropped a few stitches, and it's just where like the material gets caught. If you've worked with mohair before, then you probably like have experienced it as well. What I would suggest is like every sort of like few rows or every 10 rows, just check how many stitches you've got left on your needle to make sure you're not accidentally losing stitches. But don't be intimidated by that. It's so worth it for the I don't know why I'm doing this. It's because it's like air. Like, it's so worth it to make something this intricate and beautiful, and I literally feel like an angel when I wear it. I'll leave all the sizing info and the gauge on the screen now. If you don't know what a gauge is, it's basically however many stitches and rows would be found in a 4x4 inch square, or a 10 centimetre by 10 centimetre square. You really do need to try and stick to the gauge. If you don't, then your garment will come out either too big or too small, and it all depends on your needle size, your yarn, and how loosely or tightly you knit. Speaking of how loosely or tightly you knit, you do need to knit loosely for this project. So it uses a 7mm needle, but you kind of like, you don't want to be like pulling the yarn really tight and creating loads of tension, because then you can't slide the stitches up and down the needle and it just gets really stiff and horrible to work with. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It helps out my channel so much. We're continuing to grow, and I just want my free tutorials to be available to as many people as possible. Also subscribe if you want to stick around and see more tutorials from me. I've got something exciting coming up, and I'm just going to say one word: Halloween. Anyway, let's get crafting.
Okay, so you're going to need some mohair style yarn. I'm using Drops brushed alpaca silk. It's 77% alpaca and 23% silk, and it's an aran / worsted weight yarn. You're also going to need some 7mm needles. You can use straight needles or you can work back and forth on circular. And then you also need some scissors, 2 stitch markers, which I'll just be using bobby pins, a measuring tape and a yarn needle. So as always, we're going to start off with a slip knot. Just insert the needle into that slip knot and we're going to cast on our beginning stitches. So I've just left that on the screen for you. As you can see, it does start off quite slow and fiddly, but you do get used to it. So if you look at the stitch I'm doing now, I'm not going to pull too tight. You can see there's quite a bit of slack been left there. Please do not cast on too tightly or knit too tightly throughout this tutorial, because otherwise, because of the nature of the yarn, it just gets stuck and really stiff on the needles. So I'm just taking my time and being really careful not to pull the yarn too tight. And you can just see here that I'm easily able to move my stitches along my needle. If you've done a few stitches and you can't, then you need to go back and do it looser. Okay, so now I've got my cast on stitches, and again I can just move them quite easily up and down my needle. All we're going to do for every size is knit every single stitch across the row. Remember what I said about accidentally dropping stitches? I accidentally dropped quite a few stitches and had to redo a whole panel all over again. So just be careful, because the yarn can kind of get knotted up and stuck like to itself, if that makes sense. And so yeah, just be really careful not to knit too tightly and not to drop stitches by accident. So now I've done one row of knit stitches and you can see what that looks like. We're now going to do one row of purl stitches all the way across. So now you have two beautiful rows. We're going to continue with this, so knit along the next row and then purl along the row after that and alternate between the two until your work measures the correct length. This is going to make up the front panel and we need to make sure we finish after a wrong side row. So continue with that and come back when it's time to move on to the next step. So here is what my panel looks like. It's measuring 21 inches because I'm making the size small, and now we're going to bind off. So if you're unsure to bind off, you knit the first two stitches. Then you insert the left needle into the first stitch that you just knit, and then pull it over the second stitch you just knit, and that's one stitch bound off. Then you knit the next stitch and then take that first one on the needle and pull it over the second one and repeat. So you're just taking that left needle and always inserting it into the first stitch that is on that needle and pulling it over the second stitch that's on the needle. Continue to do that across the row. Once you've done that, you can cut the yarn. This is what it should look like when it's all done. Now what we need to do is repeat the steps the exact same for the back panel, but it's going to be slightly different in length. So you cast on your stitches, knit one row, purl one row and repeat until your work measures however much is on the screen now. Here I'm just showing you what mine looks like and I'm going to bind off, the same as we did before. This is what the two panels look like side by side. You can see the one on the right is just ever so slightly longer than the one on the left. Yours may be different depending on what size you're making, so I'm leaving some notes on the screen. Now it's time to start the sleeves. So again, we're going to start with the slip knot. We are going to do the same thing again, but the measurements and the amount of stitches to cast on are different. So you're going to cast on however many it says to cast on the screen. Once you've done that, you need to knit one row, purl one row and repeat that, alternating between the two rows until your work measures however much is on the screen now, and you need to make two sleeves the exact same. Once you get to the length that you need, you can bind off. Here I'm just showing you what one of my sleeves looks like before binding off. So here's what my two sleeves look like. You should now have two sleeves, a front panel and a back panel. Make sure you know which is your front panel and which is your back panel, because some back panels are longer than the front panels, some front panels are longer than the back panels, and some are the same length. So here's my front and back panels. My back panel is on the left, my front panel is on the right. What I'm doing now is just arranging the front and the back panels with the bind off edges next to each other. So you can see I've put those two edges together. Those are both the edges where I bound off my stitches, and now I'm just turning the work so the right side is facing down and the wrong side is facing up. Now you need to grab your tape measure and your two stitch markers, and from the edge I'm just measuring in 2.5 inches from the edge of the panel inwards, and then mark that with a stitch marker. And you can see I'm just doing that for the front and the back panel just to make sure they're both completely even, and then putting that stitch marker, the same one, through both panels, and that will just hold them together. Then you need to do the same on the other side. So now they're both joined together at the shoulder. So this section here is the section that we're going to seam together, so from the stitch marker outwards, and the same on the other side as well. Grab your yarn needle and the yarn that you've been using. If you know how to crochet, you can actually crochet these bits together and all the rest of the bits together as well if you prefer that, but I prefer using a yarn needle. So I'm just holding those two sections together. I've got the front panel and the back panel, and I'm actually using a tail from where we bound off to sew these together. And so just make sure you go through the front panel and the back panel, sew them together, take your time with it, go as neatly as you can because it pays off. I say it every time, but you don't want to spend all this time knitting something so beautiful and then ruin it by rushing this part. So I know a lot of you hate it, but in my opinion, it is totally worth it, and it really doesn't take that long. So I'm just going to keep doing that until I get to the stitch marker, and then when I get to the stitch marker, I'm just going to secure the yarn. And there we go, I'm just going to remove the stitch marker and then do one more. Then to secure it, I'm just going back into a previous stitch. Don't pull the yarn all the way through. Then insert the needle through that little loop and pull tight. And now that's secured and not going anywhere. Now we need to do the same on the other side and just make sure you still have the wrong side facing towards you. Once you've done that, you need to lay out your work flat with the wrong side facing up, and then place your sleeves so they sit perpendicular to the body, and you want the bind off edge to be against the body. So I'm just going to show you a bit more in depth what I'm doing. So you need your 2 stitch markers, and I'm measuring my sleeve. So my sleeve measures 14 inches across. Now I'm taking the measurement of 14, dividing it by 2, and then from the centre, so where that seam is that I'm pointing to now, what we just did, from there down one panel, I'm measuring out half of 14, which is 7, and marking that with a stitch marker. And then from that seam again, from the shoulder seam down the other panel, I'm measuring out 7 inches again and marking that with a stitch marker. Now both the stitch markers are there, that is where the edges of the sleeve are going to go, and we're going to seam together this gap here so that we can attach the sleeve to the main body. So grab your yarn and your yarn needle. I'm just joining the sleeves onto the stitch markers as well, just to make it easier for myself. So we need to work on closing that gap. Starting where one stitch marker is and just making sure you insert the needle through the sleeve and through the body. Keep it as neat as you can, take your time. And you can see I'm just starting to close up that gap. The seam is looking nice and neat, and I'm just going to continue to close up that gap till I get to the next stitch marker. So now we have our first sleeve attached. It's time to do the exact same thing on the other side with the other sleeve. Make sure the wrong sides are facing up and do the exact same again. Sorry about the weird angle, but it's so big that I can barely fit it in the camera lens, but just showing you what your work should be looking like. Now we just need to seam up the sleeves and the sides. So grab the work by the shoulder seams, and then you're going to lay the jumper flat. So you want to lay it out the way it would look if it was finished. Remember, my back panel is longer than my front panel. It's really important that we start this section from the wrist, up the sleeve to the armpit, and then down the body, but we don't go down the body all the way because we're going to keep a slit up the side. Then we have to do the same on the other side, from the wrist, up the sleeve to the armpit, down the body to the same point. So I'm just grabbing my stitch markers and I'm going to measure from the armpit down the body to see where I'm going to place the stitch marker, and where that means like where the side split is going to start from. So I measured down about 8 inches I think, but I suggest you measure down just over halfway, and then the reason I measured that is just so that I can make sure I get the same measurement on the other side so that they're going to be completely even. So there you can see I've got both my stitch markers on either side of the body. Grab your yarn and your yarn needle, and like I said, we're going to start from the wrist, so up the sleeve to the armpit, and then down to where that stitch marker is, and when you reach the stitch marker, that is when you stop and fasten the yarn. So I'm just speeding it up because it's the same as what we've been doing the whole time. I've gone up the arm or up the sleeve to the armpit area, as you can see. Now I'm just going to continue in the same way down the body until I reach the stitch marker. Keep going because this is the last bit. Now we just need to do it on the other side. Make sure you still have the wrong sides facing out so that the chunky seams will be on the inside when you actually wear your jumper. So this is actually inside out right now. So onto the other side. My stitch marker is there, and I'm going to do the same from the sleeve to the armpit and down to the stitch marker.
Once you have woven in those ends, try your jumper on and just bask in the fact that you made something so beautiful. Well done if you got to the end. Don't forget to tag me on socials because it literally makes my day when I see you guys wearing my patterns. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to stick around for more tutorials. But that's it from me. Have a good rest of your day or night whenever you're listening.